And it will be made available for later viewing or sending to others. If you put your email address in the chat box or email us at forum@uusf.org, we'll be happy to send you the link to this week's forum and a list of past forums available at YouTube. Our next forum will be on Sunday, May 16, with David Bollier, an activist, scholar, and writer who will speak about the commons as a new paradigm for reimagining economics, politics, and culture. So following David Bacon's presentation, there'll be time for questions and answers and discussion. And you can post your questions in the chat at any time, or wait until the end of the presentation and post a question or a comment or raise your hand to be recognized. Robin Larson is here with us to lead the question and answer session. So with that, I want to ask Dolores to say a few words about David and get into it.
Thank you. Today, we're really pleased to welcome David Bacon, a writer, photojournalist, and labor activist, particularly in the areas of immigration and international politics. For 20 years, David Bacon was a labor organizer for unions in which immigrant workers made up a large percentage of the membership. Those include the United Farm Workers, the United Electrical Workers, and others. Those experiences gave him a unique insight into changing conditions in the workforce, the impact of the global economy and migration, and how these factors influence the struggle for workers' rights. He has written several books and numerous articles on the subject of immigration and the lives of the workers, particularly those who work as agricultural workers in the fields. His latest book is In the Fields of the North by the University of California Press in 2017. His photography archive is now in the Green Library at Stanford University, and his documentary photography has been exhibited nationally and in Mexico, the United Kingdom, and Germany. His topic today is immigration, crisis, and reform, and it will hopefully provide some insight for what is happening now on this very important issue. Welcome, David Bacon, to our forum.
Well, thank you for having me. And I'm going to share the screen here because I'm going to show some photographs while I'm talking. And let me just get into here and do it. Okay. So I assume everybody can see what's on the screen, hopefully. Everything okay? Good. All right. Well, I've talked with many farm workers over the years about how and why people have come to the US. People who've come without papers, and so it's people who've come as H-2A guest workers. And we'll get into what H-2A workers are or what the H-2A program is a little bit later, but just suffice it to say that under the H-2A program, growers are able to go to other countries, mostly Mexico, and recruit workers and bring them to the United States with a visa that says that people can only work for that grower or labor contractor that brings them, and that they can only stay in the US for the length of that contract, which by the rules of the program have to be less than a year. There are some other rules to this program too, which we'll get into later. In any event, talking about the reasons why people are coming, the reasons for that people come, whether they're undocumented or guest workers, are pretty much all the same. But once people are here, the difference in their experience is enormous, depending on whether they've come with that H-2A visa or with no visa, in other words, with no papers. And that difference was established in the Bracero program, which existed in this country from 1942 to 1964. You know, we celebrate Cesar Chavez's birthday every year. We just celebrated it again a month ago. And so I wanted to start with his photograph because he was such a fierce opponent of the Bracero program. And today I want to talk about that program and its links to the current H-2A program, what impact this H-2A program has on the workers themselves who are part of it, and then on the other farm workers living in the communities around them. And finally, I'm going to take a look at the alternative to it that our movement proposed in the past, especially by people like Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta or Ernesto Galarza or Bert Corona, people who were essentially the heroes of the civil rights movement, the Chicano civil rights movement, and then talk about what choices are confronting the Biden administration and Congress now. So as I said, I'm going to show photographs while I'm talking so that we can see who it is that we're talking about. So just before the election, President Trump, last November, President Trump made a desperate bid to maintain the support of some of his most loyal supporters, namely corporate fruit and vegetable growers. And Trump told the US Department of Agriculture not to collect the information that was needed by states to set the minimum wages for 250,000 guest workers on US farms. If the federal government does not set these wages, then workers receive only the minimum wage in each state. And that can be the federal minimum wage, which in Georgia, for instance, the federal minimum wage is $7.75 an hour. For farm workers, this means that their wages would be slashed. And of course, for growers, what that means is additional profit.
I would love to see it hanging in your place.
I'm sorry? Oh, okay. I thought somebody was asking a question. In Washington state, apple growers, who are among the biggest in the US, they produced last year 138 million 40-pound boxes, which are worth about $2.5 billion. And those apples are picked by 50,000 workers, including about 17,500 workers on that H-2A guest worker visa. So each worker really is producing about $500,000 worth of fruit. Now that year, the federal government, this is 2019, I'm sorry, not last year, 2019. And for 2019, the federal government determined through this information collecting process that's done by the US Department of Agriculture, that the minimum wage for a guest worker in Washington should be $15.03 an hour. And at that time, the state minimum wage was $12. So had the higher wage not been in effect, workers would have earned $3 less an hour. And for 6 months of picking, that reduction would have amounted to about $3,000 apiece, which is a big part of a year's earnings for a farm worker. Washington state apple growers, on the other hand, would have saved about $52 million. A suit by the United Farm Workers and Farm Worker Justice, a Washington, D.C. advocacy organization, won a preliminary injunction preventing the US Department of Agriculture from canceling the survey. But then the US Department of Labor, the day before the election, announced a new formula for calculating the guest worker minimum. And this wage, by the way, is called the adverse effect wage rate, and I'll explain why in a minute. Freezing it for 2 years before indexing that wage to inflation. That's what the Department of Labor was suggesting. The Department of Labor itself estimated that as a result, growers would have pocketed $178 million a year that they would otherwise have had to pay to workers, and over 10 years, about $1.68 billion. Now, the Department of Labor was then sued by Familias Unidas por la Justicia, which is the new union for Washington State Washington State farm workers. The union's president, Ramon Torres, argued that lowering that wage for H-2A workers would have an impact on all farm workers. Because the Department of Labor refused to set a minimum piece rate, he said his own wages, and Ramon is not an H-2A worker, Ramon is somebody who lives here in the US. Ramon said that his own wages for picking cherries, for instance, would drop by 17%, costing him $3,400 in lost wages. So fortunately, one of the first decisions that the incoming Biden administration made on its first day in office was to withdraw that Trump administration order. The Trump administration made numerous changes to this country's agricultural guest worker program in the year before the election. In April, President Trump announced that while stopping almost all kinds of legal immigration for at least 2 months, and eventually was extended to December, he was placing no limits on the continued recruitment of H-2A guest workers by growers. He claimed that the spreading COVID pandemic made his order necessary, but then he could come up with no evidence to show that a ban covering legal immigration, including all forms of family-based migration, would stop the virus's spread, but a guest worker program would not. The schizophrenic nature of Trump's immigration order was a response to pressure from growers to exempt agricultural guest worker programs from the administration's assault on immigrants. But it's also a step into the past. And to see why that is, we have to look at the bracero roots of the H-2A program. In Chicano and Mexicano families throughout the Southwest, the grandfathers who came to the United States as braceros are mostly gone now. From the program's inception in 1942 to its abolition in 1964, bracero labor produced enormous wealth for the growers who used that program. But that wealth came at a price. Braceros were almost all young men, recruited into a program that held them in labor camps, often fenced behind barbed wire, separate from the people around them. When their contracts ended, they were summarily shipped back to Mexico. Growers used braceros to replace local farm workers, themselves immigrants from Mexico and the Philippines, in order to keep wages low and often to break strikes. To bring their families here, braceros had to work many seasons for a grower who might, on their own goodwill, finally help them to get legal status. Other people simply left the bracero camps and lived here without legal status, in other words, as undocumented people, for years. In fact, for up until 1986, when the amnesty law was passed. In 1958, Henry Anderson, who was an economist, charged that, he said, injustice is built into the present system, and no amount of patching and tinkering will make of it a just system. Foreign contract labor programs in general will, by their very nature, wreak harm upon the lives of the persons directly and indirectly involved, and upon the human rights our Constitution still holds to be self-evident and inalienable. You know, Henry Anderson, who actually belonged to the Presbyterian Church over in Berkeley, wrote that report for the University of California as a graduate student, and then the growers wanted him fired for saying it, and the University of California actually suppressed his report. But his warning cannot be buried safely in the past, because today, contract labor in agriculture is mushrooming again, with workers mostly brought from Mexico, but also from Central America and the Caribbean. And debate over the impact of that program is unfolding in a virulent anti-immigrant atmosphere, much like that of the 1950s. In the Cold War era, the United States government mounted huge immigration raids. Farm labor activists of that era charged that they were intended to produce a shortage of workers in the fields. Fay Bennett, who is the executive secretary of the National Sharecroppers Fund, which was sort of this left-wing advocacy organization for sharecroppers of that era, she reported that in 1954, and these are her words, she said, the domestic labor force has been driven out. In a 4-month period, 300,000 Mexicans were arrested and deported or frightened back across the border. All told, about 1.1 million people were deported to Mexico in 1 year alone, 1954, in the infamous Operation Wetback. And as the raids drove undocumented workers back to Mexico, the government then relaxed the federal requirements on housing, wages, and food for braceros, in other words, to make the program cheaper for growers to use. In 1956 alone, 445,197 braceros were brought to work on US farms, 153,000 just in California. So you can see what's going on here, you know, deporting people back to Mexico and then bringing people back as braceros. People met, you know, the braceros made up almost a quarter of the 2 million wage workers on US farms that year, according to the Department of Agriculture. The availability of braceros held down farm worker earnings. In the decade of the 1950s, city wages here in California rose 3 times as fast as farm worker wages because of the downward pressure from the bracero program. By law, bracero wages were not supposed to undermine wages for resident workers, and growers were supposed to offer jobs to local workers before they were allowed to bring braceros in. And these are still provisions of the current H-2A program. But the activists of that era accused large growers of offering wages lower than domestic migrants would accept in order to create an artificial labor shortage and justify a request for braceros. Again, Faye Bennett, who from the National Farmer Sharecroppers Fund said, the alleged domestic labor shortage in rural areas is artificially created by pay rates that are too low for decent living. And the activists of those years who protested included the future leaders of the United Farm Workers, Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, and Larry Itliong, as well as leading community organizers, Bert Corona and Ernesto Galarza. They convinced Congress to end the bracero program in 1965 by repealing Public Law 78. And in its place, they won an immigration policy that was based on family reunification instead of one based on growers' need for a labor supply at low wages. And that law was called the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965, which is also known as the Hart-Celler Act. Family preference migration, in which immigrants can get residence visas, that is green cards or permanent residence, based on their family relationships with people living in the US, was a victory that was won by the civil rights movement. Trump suspended that family preference system in a tweet last April. And at the same time, he did everything he could to ensure that the H-2A program would grow rapidly. So unless the new administration, the Biden administration, moves to halt it, this program is going to continue to mushroom, while the family preference alternative that we fought for is going to become more and more out of reach for the families who want to reunite. Today's labor picture on US farms has changed surprisingly little from that of the 1950s. Industrial agriculture in the US relies on Mexican labor as it has for a century. About 2.4 million people presently work for wages in US fields, and Mexicans make up 2/3 of the workforce. US immigration law and its enforcement don't try to eliminate Mexicans from the workforce, but to control the conditions under which people live and work. Mexican academic Jorge Bustamante argues that a primary purpose of US immigration law historically has been and still is to regulate the price of Mexican labor in the United States. Especially since the enactment of the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1994, the economic forces that displace people in Mexico, pushing them across the border, have made migration a necessity for survival for millions of families. And during times of heavy enforcement, hundreds of people die on the border each year, just as Woody Guthrie described in his song Deportee. He sang, "We died in your hills, we died in your deserts, both sides of the river, we died just the same." And he wrote that song in 1949. The bracero program channeled that flow of people into a cheap and convenient system for growers. And today the H-2A visa program serves the same function. Although the bracero program was abolished in 1964, the H-2 visa on which it was based was never eliminated. And in 1986, Congress again authorized an organized farm labor importation program and created the H-2A visa. Growers recruiting H-2A workers, mainly from Mexico, must apply to the Department of Labor, specifying the type of work, the living conditions, and the wages that workers will receive. The company must provide transportation and housing. Workers are given contracts for less than a year and have to leave the country when their work is done. While they're in the US, those workers are tied to the grower that recruits them. Workers in this system can easily be pressured to work to exhaustion. If they get sick or disabled, they can be sent home. If workers protest mistreatment, or if they go on strike or organize, they can be legally fired and have to leave the country. In theory, growers have to advertise for local workers first and can only bring in guest workers if too few local workers are available. And currently, every state is required to survey wages, what we were talking about at the beginning, to establish this adverse effect wage rate. California's adverse effect wage rate last year, 2020, was $14.77 an hour, while our minimum wage here in California last year was $12. Even without the Trump order to stop collecting data for setting that wage, farm worker advocates have pointed out that instead of protecting local wages, it actually puts a ceiling on them. Growers can simply respond to demand for wage increases by their local workforce by hiring H-2A workers instead. Nevertheless, those calculations of that guest worker wage are critical. In 2018, for instance, the Washington Farm Labor Association, which is the second largest H-2A labor contractor in the country, convinced Washington authorities to remove a minimum piece rate for H-2A workers picking apples. And that effectively lowered the harvest wage by as much as $6 an hour. Isolation, as we see here in this photograph, binds guest workers to their jobs. People are often housed in barracks on the grower's property, miles from the nearest town with no transportation of their own. That isolation is reinforced by everything from barbed wire fences to threats. A third of the workers interviewed by the Centro de los Derechos de Migrantes said that they couldn't leave the housing or work site. Many H-2A workers told of threats made by supervisors that they would be reported to ICE or law enforcement. Between recruitment costs and unreimbursed travel expenses, the vast majority of workers start those H-2A jobs deeply in debt, and they pay bribes in Mexico to get that visa. All of the workers interviewed in that study suffered violations of basic labor laws, including minimum wages, breaks, and others. 86% reported that the companies wouldn't hire women. Half complained of bad housing. 43% were not paid the wages that they were promised in their contracts. Growers, on the other hand, have little to fear because of these violations. In 2019, out of 11,400 employers using the H-2A program, only 26, that is 1/4%, were barred from recruiting, and that was just for 3 years. During the Bracero program, workers were employed directly by growers and hired through grower associations, county by county, here in California. Today, however, the 3 largest employers of H-2A workers are labor contractors, private businesses, in other words. The North Carolina Growers Association, the Washington Farm Labor Association, and Fresh Harvest, which is the biggest one here in California. One grower alone, Washington State Circle Fruit Company, brought in 3,400 pickers in 2019. And unlike the Bracero era, when recruitment was jointly managed by the US and Mexican government, recruitment today is privatized. The reality is nobody knows for sure who all the recruiters are, how they recruit people in Mexico, or what their arrangements are with US growers. The largest recruiter is probably a company called CSI, which used to be called Manpower of the Americas. It recruited 30,000 Mexican workers in 2017, and it's even bigger now. Manpower of the Americas maintained a legal blacklist, I saw it, I have a copy of it, of workers who would be denied employment. In other words, workers who they would refuse to hire for the coming season, including people who had been involved in worker activism, of course, who had protested bad conditions, but also people who just simply worked too slowly. The company was created to bring workers from Mexico for what is today the largest H-2A employer, the North Carolina Growers Association, that was founded in 1989 by Stan Ury, who formerly worked for North Carolina's unemployment office. And there is this sort of like unemployment office, Bracero labor contractors, or H-2A labor contractors complex, kind of like the military industrial complex, where people go back and forth between state unemployment agencies and these recruitment organizations, because these recruitment organizations are making so much money. Under pressure from this guy Ury, Stan Ury, the courts have ruled that anti-discrimination laws don't apply to H-2A workers. In other words, employers can recruit men exclusively, which would be a violation of the law if it was happening here. The Age Discrimination in Employment Act does not cover H-2A workers which leaves employers free to give preference to young men who are able to meet high production standards, in other words, work to exhaustion. Despite his political clout, in 2015, Urey was found guilty of defrauding the US government and sentenced to 13 months in prison. The Department of Labor, however, continues to approve his company's application for H-2A workers. They got 11,000 jobs certified last year. As was the case in the 1950s, increased deportations parallel the growing use of H-2A workers. Under President Reagan and Bush, the average number of people deported each year from the United States ranged from 21,000 under Reagan to 33,000 under Bush Sr. Under the Clinton administration, it tripled to 108,000 a year as the border was militarized and laws criminalizing aspects of undocumented status were passed. Under George Bush Jr., it jumped again to 251,000 per year. And then under President Obama, it peaked at 383,000 people per year during his administration. President Trump, through ferocious detention programs mainly, actually brought deportations down to 275,000 people per year. The growth of the H-2A program paralleled the increase in deportations. In other words, what Faye Bennett was talking about during the 50s is still happening. In 1992, fewer than 10,000 visas were issued. That number tripled by 2005, and under Presidents Obama and Trump, it mushroomed. In 2019, growers were certified to bring in 257,000 workers, a tenth of the total agricultural labor force. And last year, in the middle of the pandemic, it jumped to 275,000 workers. In 2019, the state of Georgia alone brought in 30,000 workers compared to its non-H-2A workforce of 48,000. In other words, over a third of its workforce now is made up of H-2A workers. In California, in 2019, it was about 19,000 workers. Last year, it jumped to 25,000 workers. There's still fewer in comparison to our huge workforce here in California, which is about 375,000 workers. But the percentage of H-2A workers is jumping every year. According to the National Agricultural Workers Survey, about half the country's 2.5 million farm workers have no legal immigration status. In other words, they're undocumented. And in California, the percentage here is undoubtedly higher. The farm sales of California growers reached over $50 billion in 2019, which is an enormous production of food and profit by people who are mostly undocumented. Growers claim that because of increased border enforcement, the number of available workers to do this work is falling, although the industry employed virtually the same number of workers that it did 20 years ago. Tom Nassif, who's the president of the Western Growers Association, says there is a severe ag labor shortage and it's only going to get worse. How true is this? Well, unemployment in the farm worker towns here in California is always higher than it is in urban areas. In March of last year, for instance, the unemployment rate in the Imperial County was 15.3%, and in Merced County it was 10%, and in Los Angeles it was 4%, and San Francisco only 2.5%. Yet this guy Nassif from the Western Growers Association says that even if growers increased pay and overtime benefits, it wouldn't attract any additional workers into the fields. Meanwhile, immigration rates in the rural areas of California have increased, and the fear they generate was dramatized by the deaths of an immigrant couple in Delano in 2018 who crashed their van while fleeing in terror from immigration agents. The Department of Homeland Security document checks led to the firings of hundreds of workers at many large San Joaquin Valley farms. United Farm Workers Vice President Armando Elenes, he says, ICE does audits and raids, and then growers demand changes that will make the H-2A workers even cheaper by eliminating wage requirements or the requirement that they provide housing. Reducing the available labor and the increased use of H-2A are definitely connected and go hand in hand. Growers don't want to look at how they can make the workplace better and attract more workers. They just want what's cheaper. In one celebrated case, under the Obama administration in 2010, federal immigration authorities used the E-Verify system, which is a system, it's a database that's maintained by the federal government that employers are supposed to check or can check in order to determine what the legal status is of somebody that they're hiring. So in 2010, under Obama, immigration authorities used that system to identify 550 undocumented workers at a huge apple ranch that belonged to the Gebbers family in Eastern Washington and forced Gebbers to fire all of them. The company was then required to use the H-2A program to recruit workers from Mexico and Jamaica to replace those who had lost their jobs. And I'll talk in a minute about what happened to some of them. The purpose of that enforcement tactic is not to deny labor to growers. It is to return to a system for managing it, like the old Bracero program, H-2A. And the price for doing this was paid by two workers at the Gebbers farms. One H-2A worker from Mexico, Juan Carlos Santiago Rincon, died on July 8th. And a second from Jamaica, Earl Edwards, died on July 31st, both of them from COVID-19. An investigation by the state of Washington found that Gebbers had not maintained adequate social distancing in its workforce. The state only even found out about Santiago's death, not from the company, but from an anonymous phone call from workers. And then they issued an order telling the farm to comply with its rules. And nevertheless, 5 days later, Edwards had died. Ernesto Dimas, another Gebbers worker, told the Seattle Times that the company sent workers into the orchards even when they showed symptoms of illness. He said, you could hear people coughing everywhere. By July, 120 workers on that farm had tested positive, and another 156 were showing symptoms already of COVID. Hundreds of workers were sleeping close to each other in bunk beds, and the state's requirement that they be separated into groups of 15 was routinely ignored. Why? Because the company was not concerned about enforcement. One state official charged Gebbers continually failed to comply even after the first worker died and our repeated presence at the farm. Gebbers was actually fined $2 million and said that it would appeal, but for a company that's that big, that fine is just a cost of doing business. And meanwhile, the virus spread among H-2A workers all across the country. California, in 1 month alone, October, reported 360 cases of H-2A workers who were getting sick at 7 employers, including one person who had died. The coronavirus crisis added extreme risk to a bedrock of inequality and exclusion. Like everybody, H-2A workers must try to maintain the recommended 6 feet of distance between people in housing, transportation, and working conditions. But that is impossible under the conditions H-2A workers live and work in. And this photograph here is evidence that this is true. According to Ed Kisam, who's a researcher, Ed says, although the H-2A guest workers make up only 10% of the US farm labor workforce, their risk of COVID-19 infection is particularly high due to the Department of Labor's requirement that employers provide them with housing. Now, it sounds like employers are doing them a favor, right? But this is what Kisam says. He says, in order to comply as cost effectively as possible, almost all housing provided by employers is congregate housing, where typically a number of workers share bedrooms or sleep in barrack-style quarters, as well as sharing cooking facilities and bathrooms. And what we see in this photograph is basically what's typical, these kind of rooms inside barracks in which you have 2 sets of bunk beds with workers sleeping right on top of each other. Despite this record of illness and the obvious danger to workers, a regulation handed down by Washington State's Health Department permits housing conditions that actually cause the virus to spread. The barracks, as we see here, for H-2A workers are divided into rooms around a common living and kitchen area, and 4 workers live in each room, sleeping in 2 bunk beds. Another huge grower in Washington, Stemmelt Brothers, says that it has 90 dormitories in central Washington with 1,677 beds, half of which are bunk beds. Sleeping in bunk beds in dormitories like this, according to state authorities, is an acceptable risk, although public health officials warn that farm workers are more vulnerable to getting COVID-19 because they live in these very close quarters. Rosalinda Guillen, who was an organizer for the UFW and then went up to Washington State and began an organization called Community to Community. She says, the lives of these workers are being sacrificed for the profits of growers. The pressure on people in Mexico to migrate will continue to push people to come, since the conditions that are displacing people in Mexico are very deep, and changing them will require reordering the relationship between the US and Mexico. As early as 1949, Ernesto Galarza, the pioneering farm worker organizer, argued that Mexican migrants, and these are Galarza's words, are forced to seek better conditions north of the border by the slow but relentless pressure of United States agricultural, financial, and oil corporate interests on the entire economic and social evolution of the Mexican nation. And that pressure has only grown stronger in the last 70 years. Increasing wages substantially in the fields here in the US would make jobs more attractive to resident farm workers. The H-2A program, however, keeps farm worker wages close to the minimum, and that's a recipe for pressing employers willingly or unwillingly to use the H-2A system. And last year's total number of certified H-2A applications, 250,000 people, is increasing. Well, it increased in 1 year by 10%. An agricultural system in which half the workforce would eventually consist of H-2A workers is not unlikely. Florida, Georgia, and Washington are already approaching this situation. Rosalinda Guillen argues that proposals expanding H-2A, these are her words, don't address the needs of most farm workers who are already here. They shift agriculture in the wrong direction, which will lead to the eventual replacement of domestic workers and create even more of a crisis than currently exists for their families and communities. Ramon Torres, who's the president of Familias Unidas por la Justicia, this new farm worker union in Washington, says that his experience in helping H-2A workers protest labor violations makes him doubt that politicians are going to change their situation. Ramon says this. He says, employers will continue to have the power to punish and deport these workers if they resist. We know they'll do this because that's what they're doing now. Growers complain that they can't find enough workers, but the reason they can't is that conditions and wages are so bad that we have people living in garages or sleeping under trees. Organizing the union is the only thing that has worked to change conditions here for the better, but there is no protection in the H-2A program for people's right to organize. And H-2A workers do organize, even in spite of the lack of protection. In June of 2018, 21 guest workers at the King Fuji Ranch, which we're looking at here, went on strike. And according to one of those workers, Sergio Martinez, he said, when we can't make the production, they threaten us, telling us that they won't let us come back to work the next year. Pressure to work harder and faster is permitted by the US Department of Labor. In fact, it's written into the certifications that allow growers to import workers. And according to Martinez, he said, they threatened to send us back to Mexico and put us on the blacklist. And that blacklist was effective. Although workers went back to work after that strike, after winning some improvements, Edgar Franks from the new union, Familias Unidas, says that when he revisited the ranch the following season, none of the active strike participants were there anymore. The largest agricultural employers have responded to worker demands with proposals to expand the H-2A system. And the most far-reaching bill was just passed by the House for the second time. It passed once under Trump, and it was passed just a few weeks ago in the House recently, and it's called the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. It's currently sitting in the Senate awaiting a vote there. It guarantees growers a labor supply at a price they want to pay, while at the same time providing a very complex and lengthy pathway to legal residence for some undocumented farm workers. About half of the agricultural workforce, in other words, about 1.2 million people, would be able to apply for a visa if they have done farm work for 2 years. But those who have applied, who have lived in the US for more than 10 years, will still have to wait 4 years before being able to apply for a residence visa. And those who've worked for less than 10 years are going to have to wait for 8 years. And during those periods of time, the 4 and 8 years, they have to continue working in agriculture, a minimum of 100 days a year in order to stay in that program. In other words, if they don't continue working at that rate, they lose that certified status and they become undocumented. And that, of course, 100 work days a year was going to be difficult for a lot of people to come up with. This bill makes it mandatory that growers use that E-Verify database and refuse to hire workers without legal status. Think of what that means. For the 1.2 million workers without papers, first of all, that traps people in their jobs and it keeps them from going from employer to employer, which is normal life for seasonal farm workers. In other words, what this law is saying is that while if you're undocumented and you can't or don't qualify for this new legalization program, you have to keep on working for the person that you're working for now, because if you leave that job or you get fired, another employer is not going to be able to hire you because they will have to use this E-Verify system to check your legal status. And if you don't have legal status, you won't be hired. In other words, it's going to drive you out of your job. Since growers are no longer going to be able to hire undocumented workers, then they will use the H-2A program, and the bill makes this even more attractive. Growers are going to be able to use federal programs, for instance, for farm worker housing, which we set up and pay for in taxes to house families to build their barracks for guest workers, which is a direct subsidy. It suspends for 1 year the increase in the adverse effect wage rate, just like President Trump tried to do. After 10 years, that guaranteed wage for H-2A workers could be abolished entirely. And the net effect would be to bring down H-2A workers closer to the minimum wage. It places workers with H-2A visas into wage competition with the domestic labor force and depresses the wages of all farm workers. And there is no protection for the right of farm workers to organize unions to change this. Growers threaten that if wages rise, consumers are going to have to pay much higher prices for food. Yet a woman picking strawberries in a California field gets less than 20 cents for each plastic clamshell box, which we pay for at Safeway $3 to $4. And doubling her wage would hardly even change the price in the store. Today's food system is built on her poverty, and growers' efforts to build a labor force of temporary workers, what it really does is it cements that poverty into place. Rosalinda Guillen says expanding H-2A, her words, doesn't address the needs of most farm workers who are already here. They shift agriculture in the wrong direction to the eventual replacement of domestic workers and even more of a crisis that currently exists for their families and communities. Mary Bauer described these conditions in a report for the Southern Poverty Law Center 10 years ago, which she called Close to Slavery. And she says, I haven't seen any significant improvement in the economic situation of farm workers in 30 years. Abuse is baked into a structure in which workers are vulnerable and in which there is always a new supply of workers to replace the old, the sick, or those who complain and protest. And a program that gives workers virtually no bargaining power creates a perfect storm of vulnerability. The problem with protecting workers through more regulations is that regulations cannot overcome the profound power imbalance between employer and worker under the H-2A program. And this is the same problem that we saw under the old Bracero program. And the answer that was given by the Chicano Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s was not to regulate the Bracero program, but to abolish it. And in its place, those activists fought for and won an immigration system based instead on family unification. The Biden administration and Congress today, they face a basic question about the direction of US immigration policy. Will the flow of Mexican and Central American migrants across the border be imprisoned in a system of cheap and disposable labor for growers? Or will it be integrated into families and communities, able to fight for rights, legal status, unions, and a better standard of living? President Biden's original immigration proposal, the US Citizenship Act, would allow all 11 million undocumented people to apply for legal immigration status and eventual citizenship. Biden said that he advocates improving the family-based immigration system, but then in practically the next breath, he also includes employment-based system, the guest worker visa program, and just recently he endorsed this Farm Workforce Modernization Act that growers want. While the H-2A program has mushroomed over the past 2 decades, the family preference system is in trouble. In fact, it has become an obstacle course in which married children, for instance, in Manila or Mexico City, who want to join their parents in the US have to wait over 20 years to get a visa. Restoring the family preference system and halting or restricting the H-2A program would have enormous consequences for this country's farm workers. The US can become a society that is dependent on unfree labor to harvest its food by expanding a guest worker program under which immigrants have few labor rights, no political rights, and are economically vulnerable. Or advocates and policymakers can reach back to the civil rights and workers' movements of the 1960s and put a premium on the welfare of farm worker families and communities. And the history of the H-2A program, as well as the documented impact of the current H-2A program, make the stakes in this debate very, very clear. So that's it. Thank you. And if you have any questions or comments, be happy.
Thank you, David. That was really excellent. Wow, a lot of information, really important. Robin, do you want to go ahead and take over?
Yeah, I will start with the earliest. Nancy Harrison, did he say oil work as well? And then she says shortly afterwards, so this bill is for the growers. So I think that was her question. Not oil. And then David and Dolores had just asked if you would expand on the statement you made about when workers have to leave the US and then what they face when they return to Mexico. What's their economic situation there?
Okay, well, you can imagine that people don't come to the US, in other words, uproot themselves or work away from their families I don't want to say willingly, but people are doing this out of necessity. Let's put it that way. It's a survival question for families. Most families, they have to go through a big debate over whether a husband or a wife or a son or a daughter come to the US. And in the case of the H-2A program, remember, because it's discriminatory, we're talking about husbands and sons because women are, generally speaking, in fact, almost entirely excluded from this program. Growers don't want women. So when people return to their home communities, whether it's simply by the end of the contract or because they're deported because they protested here in the United States, people are going back to the same situation that forced them to come to begin with. So the pressure on people to leave, to find another way to come to the United States is there. And people respond to that pressure, obviously, by doing what they have to do to survive. It's not, and it's also, it's partly survival, but it's also, well, for instance, I have a friend who's a high school teacher in Oaxaca. And he says, it's very difficult for me to stand up in front of my class and tell my students that they should go on to college and university, get educated and try and get a professional job like mine when they know perfectly well that their own family members working in the United States are earning more than I do. So this whole system is really putting migration as the only option for young people who are growing up. In fact, there's a great debate that goes on in Oaxacan communities that are sending people to the United States about what people are calling the right to stay home. In other words, what has to change in order for people to have migration as a choice, something that people can do voluntarily, but also cannot do. In other words, people have to have jobs and healthcare and high prices for farm products and the things that make staying at home a real viable option rather than migration. So this is what people face when they go back to, and consequently for many people, the answer is to come to the United States again. So, to come to the United States right now, you're being presented with basically two choices, or I would say 2.5 choices, really. One choice is to come as an undocumented person. In other words, you just cross the border, you pay a coyote and you get here. What this bill does is it tries to close that door by saying that in the future, after this bill passes, if you come to the United States that way, you will not be able to get a job in the fields because the growers will not hire you because they've got this E-Verify system they have to use to keep you from working. So that means that your other option is to sign up with the H-2A contractor, which is a very corrupt system. You have to pay to get the visa. You're not supposed to, but it's really what people have to do. Pay the cost of getting here, and then you undergo what people undergo here as H-2A workers in the United States, and then you go back again. That's why the blacklist is such a potent threat, is because what the blacklist does is it essentially says to the worker, if you cause trouble here in the United States, you go on strike or you organize or protest, or you don't even work fast enough, you will not be able to come back the following year. So you're going to get stuck in Mexico. And the reason why I call it a 2.5 alternative is that there is supposed to be, or supposedly, another way of coming here, which is the family preference system. That if you have family in the United States that can petition for you, you should be able to eventually get a residence visa, which means that when you get to the United States, if you get that residence visa, you can live like a normal person. You know, you can work or not work. You can work for this person or that company. I mean, people have to work because we all have to work as workers, unless we're rich. But you know, it gives you the freedom of movement, and you can go to Mexico for a while. You can come back here. You can be like an ordinary person. Those visas are very hard to get now. You know, during the NAFTA years, there were about, when NAFTA went into effect, there were about 4.5 million Mexican migrants living in the United States. And by the peak of migration because of NAFTA in the late 2010s, that number was about 12.5 million.
Wow.
So that was about 8 million people that came here during that period of time. So for those 12.5 million people, well, there were only about 5.5 million visas available, which meant that about 7 million people had to come. If they were going to come at all, they had to come without the visa. So that's sort of what's happened to the family preference system. It's become starved for visas. So one of the big questions in immigration system is how to reduce the backlog, how to free up visas to make the system work better so people don't have to wait 20 years to come to the United States in that preference system. But the other reality of it too is that there are people who want to come to the United States to work who don't have relatives here to petition for them. So if we don't want the H-2A system to be, or coming undocumented, to be the only alternatives for people, we have to set up a system in which people can get a visa to come here to work that does not chain them to growers, that does not force them into this low wage system, that doesn't use them as competition with existing workers here in the United States to lower wages. In other words, there have to be sort of residence visas or green cards that are made available to people who just want to come here and work. And how that happens, you know, there are a lot of different proposals that people have made, but essentially it has to be a system in which people are free, and rather than, you know, in this system of indentured servitude. And that would make it possible for people to go back and forth. And there is one other aspect, you know, in answering this question, I think is important to say too. And that is that now that we have had a year plus of pandemic here in the United States, when workers get sick in the US because of these conditions, and then go back to their home communities, what happens is that they are bringing COVID back there with them. And those home communities have very few resources as it is. The Mexican Social Security healthcare system is a mess. It wasn't able to take care of, rural health even before this. And now we are dumping these health crises that were acquired in the system here in the US on those home communities, first of all, spreading the infection, but also producing a health crisis for communities that are really not able to cope with them. So that has some pretty disastrous impacts as well, too. So I'm sorry for such a long answer to the question, but.
Here's another question. Have you found any connection between the flow of immigrants from Central America and labor contractor recruitment?
There's some, and it's growing. I mean, Central America is a small source of labor recruitment compared to Mexico. But I've heard recently reports of workers who are even being recruited out of the detention camps that were set up in Mexico just south of the border for Hondurans and Guatemaltecos who were coming up to the border and not able to get in, that there were some efforts to sign them up. And in fact, this is an option that the Biden administration is pursuing, because when they've been sending representatives to Central America to talk with the governments there about kind of what they would call normalizing the situation. In other words, no more caravans, no more waves of people coming to the United States as migrants. But on the other hand, they don't want to necessarily have to militarize the entire system and put everybody in detention camps, which is what Trump did. So one of the options that they are discussing is the increasing recruitment of people into the H-2A program from those countries. So instead of sort of looking at a human rights driven system, they are looking at a labor supply system as being the answer to the political dilemma that they're facing.
Okay. And then here's another one. In your opinion, given the history of relentless discrimination and exploitation since day one in California and beyond, do you believe that short of radical social change, this apartheid labor system could be transformed to provide for our food to be produced under just conditions? That short of radical social change, this apartheid labor system could be transformed to provide for our food to be produced under just conditions. Do you believe it's possible?
Well, the quick answer is no. I don't believe it's possible. I think radical social change is really the only way to truly resolve the, well, you're calling it the apartheid labor system. That's a good name for it. I think there are other ones too.
It's in quotes.
No, I
Somebody,
understand. I see it in the chat. Another part of it is the huge gulf between living standards in cities and rural areas. I mean, that's really, in the end, that's part of capitalism. And in order to change that, you have to change the system in a very radical way. And then also when we're looking at it in terms of the migration aspect of it, changing the relationship between the US and Mexico would require very, very fundamental social change in both countries in order to truly have people, people in the home communities in Oaxaca, for instance, are not saying that immigration should be a crime or that there's something wrong with immigration. That what they're saying is that it should be a choice, that people should be able to choose if they want to travel or not. And that requires social change in Mexico, in those communities. But it also requires changes in the relationship between the US and Mexico, because we've had, how many, God, over 200 years of the US exploiting Mexico in many different ways, whether it's the extraction from Mexico of wealth, just simply in terms of the extractive industries that the US has developed there, mining and so forth, the corporate investment, the negotiation of trade agreements, the ripping off of a great part of Mexico's territory in 1858, this relationship goes back a long, long, long ways. And I think that's why calling it apartheid is a very interesting way of looking at it, because it also refers to the status of Mexicans here in the United States who were guaranteed equality in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And we all know what those promises, turned out to be worth. So all I'm saying here is that I agree that to have a truly different system for producing food, and a truly different system in which people would have social and political equality and rights and a good standard of living, working in agriculture, whether in Mexico or here in the United States. And people in agricultural communities would have a good future for themselves, and people would want to live in agricultural communities and want to work in the fields. So, I mean, Bruce, I'm sure you can talk yourself about this a little bit, but, I've talked to many farm workers who say, there are a lot of problems with farm labor, low wages and pressure to produce and so forth, but there is something about being a farm worker that I like, and aspects of that job that I like, and the aspect of growing food, and the aspect of being close to the land. Rosalinda Guillen in Washington State talks about that we will not be able to really resolve these questions without farm workers actually having access to land, and that the land question is something that we can't ignore either. Well, you can imagine, here we have a system for producing food that is based on corporate ownership of land in huge quantities, and the industrial system that they implement in order to grow the food. And if you say that the only way to resolve this system in the favor of the people who work in it is to give farm workers access to land, well, you can imagine what resistance you're going to get from those people who like the system the way it is, and who incidentally have ownership of all of the means of production in it. So you are calling for a radical solution to it, and different people would have different words for it. I mean, you could say socialism perhaps might offer some solutions to it. In other words, getting private ownership out of the system. But the socialist systems that have tried to wrestle with this problem and establish socialist forms of ownership for land, or developing agriculture in a socialist system, have had some successes, but have also had some incredible failures to it as well too. And the Zapatistas argue for a different way of looking at it, and Rosalinda argues for a different way of looking at it. But I think what they all have in common is by saying that the current system is incapable of resolving the problems that this industrial system imposes, and that we must have social, very fundamental, radical social change. Having said that, though, we also have to look at the efforts that farm workers make to actually deal with the problems immediately. In other words, between here and socialism, we also have the problem of people trying to survive on the low wages for which they organize unions. So I think there are intermediate steps as well too, which are very important. We have to support everything that farm workers do to try to organize. It's not going to come from outside. The government is not going to change this. The only way the workers are going to make even incremental improvements in their situation is by organizing. And so we have to support every effort. And in fact, I think the worst thing about that bill, the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, is that it stands in the way of workers being able to organize. In fact, its whole objective is to keep workers in a situation where they cannot change those conditions. So on the road to this radical fundamental social change, we also need to support those efforts that workers do to change things in an immediate sense. And in a way, I think what we're doing by doing that is, who is it that's actually going to fight for radical social change anyway? The people themselves who are here. So every effort that we make and we succeed at in organizing ourselves for immediate change, I think is also a way of organizing ourselves for more fundamental kinds of change as well too.
Then here are a couple more questions. One is, do you have any opinion of AMLO, i.e. President of Mexico, because this is a macroeconomic problem and Mexico is so weak, but only artificially. What their government, Mexico, is doing, what is their government doing to better the situation?
Well, you know, AMLO, when he was campaigning for all those years before he got elected, one of the things that he talked about a lot was, in effect, the right to stay home. That that his campaign and his program called for making Mexico a country in which people wanted to live and were able to live. And you know, I was in the Zocalo when he made his inauguration speech, in which he called for let's make Mexico a country in which people can live and develop and prosper without having to go to the United States. And I think that's a big reason why many people, poor and working class people, voted for him. So this was different from the administrations that came before, because all of those PAN and PRI administrations basically said, hey, going to the United States is a wonderful thing, you know, just don't bother us about what your rights are when you get there. But those people who are sending money back home are heroes in Mexico because they are supporting the Mexican economy and supporting the families who are here. In other words, they had a very conscious and explicit labor export policy. And AMLO came into office saying, no, this was going to change. This is part of neoliberalism, and his administration was going to change it. You know, he was not promising socialism or anything. What he was saying was that we are going to raise the standard of living, essentially, in rural communities in Mexico, rather than treat them as simply the sources of migration, sources of migrants. And then those communities are going to survive on the remittances that those migrants in the United States who are working are sending home. I think that, you know, AMLO still says that, but the big but is, first of all, that recently he's been negotiating with the US government and has said, well, okay, to the US government, if you're going to have people coming to the United States, especially as H-2A workers, you can't just come to Mexico and recruit those people with private recruiters here as though the Mexican government didn't exist. You know, you should negotiate with us over how the recruitment happens and, you know, what, you know, how it takes place here, which is in effect saying that the Mexican government is going to accommodate itself to a Bracero program in the United States. It just wants some voice in how that program is carried out in Mexico. That is a big step backwards from saying that we are going to create a country in which people do not have to go to the United States to work. You know, why AMLO's doing it, I think, you know, to a certain extent, he is doing what he believes is accommodating certain political realities, one of which is that the movement of people from Mexico to the United States is not going to stop. And therefore, what should the Mexican government do about it? Should it try and negotiate something in relation to it or not? But even more than that, you know, AMLO learned some very bitter lessons in his first year as president of Mexico. Remember the way Trump got AMLO to agree to house asylum applicants in detention camps on the Mexican side of the border was shutting down the border very briefly and then saying, I'm going to do it again if you don't agree. And shutting down the border, it has an impact in the US for sure, but the impact in Mexico is economic chaos and economic disaster. And AMLO said, well, okay, I'll do it, and agreed. And then it happened again. When the COVID pandemic started, the Mexican government issued very strict regulations to the US-owned factories on the border, the maquiladoras, some of which are producing for the US defense establishment. And the companies, you know, many of them refused to comply. There were strikes by workers in those plants to force the company to shut down because of their fear at dying. In fact, there was one plant belonging to the Lear Corporation in Juarez where 12 workers died of COVID in this process. And so under that pressure, of the government and the strikes, was successful briefly in forcing some of these companies to shut their doors. And then the US government sent a defense attaché and the ambassador to go and meet with AMLO at Los Pinos and the Mexican White House, after which the Mexican government basically said, well, okay, we're going to allow those companies to restart production. So when you say Mexico is weak in this relationship, that is true. Mexico is weak in that relationship. The US has enormous power to basically threaten the Mexican government. In the past, under the PRI and Napan, they didn't have to threaten. They had governments in Mexico that willingly wanted to do what the US wanted. Here you have a government that in some ways does not. And yet the US has the power to force the Mexican government under certain circumstances to comply with what the US government wants. That's a very threatening situation. And I think that generally speaking, people here in this country who are concerned about Mexico, our solidarity movement, we were negotiating that new trade agreement with Mexico at the height of the pandemic. And how many voices did you hear in the US Congress or even here in San Francisco saying, hey, wait a minute, we should try and help defend the Mexican people and the Mexican government against what's being forced on them? And you didn't hear really much of anything. You heard a lot of concern, justifiable concern, about what the fate was of the people who were being held in those camps. And sometimes what you heard was saying, oh, well, the Mexican government is doing an awful thing, violating the human rights of these migrants, blah, 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 blah. I mean, yes, that's true, but hey, why did this situation happen? Who was pointing the finger at the US government and saying, hey, we need to do whatever we can to stop the US government from doing this and stop US corporations from doing this? And you don't hear that. There is very little of a Mexico solidarity movement in this country that is willing to take a look at what is actually happening here and to try to play some independent role in providing some breathing space for that government. Of course, Mexicans are going to have to fight with their own government over what it does and what its policies are. But we also here in the United States, we can fight over what I would call the breathing room. In other words, to stop the US government from doing what it did, for instance, in the COVID crisis in the maquiladoras. Anyway.
Here's another question. Can you say something about the role of racism in developing these policies? There have been many studies by conservative think tanks which plainly state that it is important to keep the white race pure and not to give any opportunity for migrants, especially Mexicans, to mix and socialize in the communities where they live.
Well, there's a long history of that for sure. There used to be signs in the doorways of certain hotels in Stockton that said no Filipinos allowed. Basically at a time when Filipino men were all living in labor camps and were farm workers and, subject to that kind of racist exclusion. And certainly, there's a long, long history of racism that has been directed towards Mexicans, Filipinos, Japanese and Chinese before them. Remember who works in agriculture in the United States. I mean, the roots of the US agriculture system are in slavery. It was people who were kidnapped from Africa and brought as slaves whose labor developed the whole plantation system to begin with in this country. That was the foundation of the wealth that went on to, produce the cotton mills in the North and the capitalism in this country to begin with. And that's always been true. So, the workforce here on the West Coast and the Southwest, you have waves of people, Chinese, Japanese, but immigrants, people of color. And the same kind of racist restrictions that were, the black codes, for instance, that were put on African-American people, especially after slavery, were then the pattern in a way for how people were from other countries were treated as well. You know, the first US immigration laws were laws that were intended to restrict the ability of people to come, for instance, from Asian countries, while at the same time Europeans were welcomed into Ellis Island. Remember, you know, you have these two coasts. We have Ellis Island on the East Coast for the migration of Europeans, and we have Angel Island here, which was a prison for people who were coming from China during exactly the same period of time. And that tells you about, you know, what the relative status was of each group of people, you know, as they came here. So yes, this is a very, very fundamental part of, you know, the migration system. We had a very famous legal case in the 1920s here that was filed by a Sikh man, a Punjabi from Marysville, saying that, you know, the migration of people from India should not be restricted, and people from India should have some rights. And the US Supreme Court decided that people from India were not white, and therefore could be subject to the immigration restrictions and treated in that racist way. So, you know, this has been part of the legal system and part of the economic system from its very beginning, for sure.
And here's a question specifically by Dolores and Dave. Dolores says, my Mexican father was recruited to come to the US over 70 years ago as a skilled leather worker. So the laws were different then, probably very different than farm workers. And thus he socialized with many white Americans and met my mother. Wonder if there are other recruitments going on like that for other Mexican workers, but not for farm workers.
Well, you know, just before we even get to the methods of recruitment, I mean, just a family story, your story, Dolores. I have many friends who are from families where of farm workers who married white women who were here. You know, Filipinos, for instance, in the Filipino community, migration from the Philippines was restricted to men for many decades. And those men lived in labor camps here in the US, and we had anti-miscegenation laws that said that Filipinos could not marry white women and could not marry outside of, you know, Filipinos, and yet there was no immigration of women from the Philippines because of those restrictive laws during the same period. And so we had a whole generation of men who came here to the United States who lived their entire lives as single people and died as single people. And yet many of them did try to marry and start families here. Some went back to the Philippines, and then, like my wife's father, went back to the Philippines, married the school teacher in the village he came from, and brought her to the United States. That was a pretty expensive and difficult proposition, even as late as the 40s, which is when it happened to them. Other Filipino men fell in love with white women and then had to go to states like Colorado, for instance, that didn't have anti-miscegenation laws, so that they could get married. And the same thing I think is true of Mexicans. In other words, people want families and they fall in love with each other and marry each other, you know, racist restrictions or not, right? But it is still, you know, this goes back to that previous question about the whole racial ideas about purity and so forth. You know, those anti-miscegenation laws based on the idea of not mixing races and the single drop of African blood and so forth. You know, we have this whole heritage of racist attempts to try to keep that from happening. And yet I think the wonderful reality of it is that people did exactly what your parents did, Dolores, and many other people did anyway, right? About the recruitment, you know, the programs for the recruitment of workers in this country, we have basically three big ones, or three real labor recruitment programs. Others, they're kind of like that. You know, there's student programs that basically sometimes treat students as workers, but we have three ones that are specifically for workers. So there's H-2A for farm workers, There's one that's called H2B, which is supposedly for unskilled workers outside of agriculture. So people who work planting trees in forests, or who work in fish packing plants or meat packing plants, they would come under this program. This is a lot smaller though. And then there's a high-tech program, which you sometimes see a lot of coverage of in the newspapers, for tech workers, called H1B. So, people do come through those programs. But again, those are pretty much recruitment programs which assume that people are going to come, work a while, and leave. But then also people come without being recruited specifically as workers, but come, for instance, through the family preference system. And then once people are here, you have to work. You have to make a living like everybody else. And if you come here with a certain skill, then you're going to go and try and look for a job using that skill. That would be the logical thing to do. So I don't know specifically how it happened with your grandfather, or your father rather. When you say he was recruited to come to the US as a skilled leather worker, it could be that there was some leather company here, tannery, for instance, that knew about him, and where the owner went to Mexico and then got an employment-based visa for him so that he could come to the US and work for him. That would be a kind of recruitment, and that has happened. And that happens in agriculture sometimes, usually by employers who are kind of like a little bit more humanistic, I would say. They actually want the individual person. You remember the picture of the guy with the bracero contract in front of him? He and his wife are sitting at the table. They've got some papers in front of them, bracero contract. And Roberto Garcia, the guy, he talks about how he worked as a bracero for this Japanese grower for many years. And then finally, the Japanese grower decided to try and get papers for him, and went and got a green card and a residence visa for him. And he was able to become a permanent resident, and went back to Mexico and got his wife and brought her here. And they've lived here ever since. So, employers can do that. Employers have enormous power in this system, and they can get visas for people if they want. And maybe that was what happened with your dad. You would know better anyway, I'm sure. There must be family stories about it.
Well, there's only one, there's a comment, it sounds like, much more. And then an answer from the person, Raquel. There is so much we don't know about skilled workers from Latin America coming here and prospering. Artisans, auto mechanics, oil workers is my understanding, but mainly they have to be sponsored by a firm. Would you consider that to be true?
Well, yes. I mean, first of all, people who come here with all the skills and knowledge that they had in the countries that they came from. Whatever job you had or skill you had, you come here. Even if you come as a farm, I'll give you an example. I used to work in a big electronics plant in Silicon Valley. And I found myself working one morning washing machine parts, and I was a technician next to a woman who was a line worker on the production line. And talking to her and becoming her friend, I found out that she had gotten a doctorate degree from the University of the Philippines in Manila. And there she was working for minimum wage in an electronics plant, because what she was trained in, she could not get certified to work in here in the United States. So, I mean, the answer is yes, people come here as oil workers and all these other kinds of skills that people have. Whether people can use those skills here,
Yeah.
Sometimes yes and sometimes no.
A lot of times no, because there's a sort of a prejudice against job training programs and higher degrees being not from America. That people should undergo a degree program in America or a training program in America to be truly eligible.
Well, it's a very contradictory system. In Manila, right next to Rizal Park, are all of these offices for all of these schools that will teach people how to meet the requirements to get certified as a healthcare worker here in the United States. LVNs, nurses, RNs even, although mostly not RNs, mostly down below. And you have actually people who go through the Philippine educational system and become doctors or RNs, and then who go and get certified as LVNs, in other words, a lower classification, so that people can come here. And those schools feed people into our healthcare system. It's a big industry coming from the Philippines. So in a way, you know, people are getting downsized in order to be able to come here. And it's also something that is really hurting the Philippines, because the Philippines has a shortage of healthcare workers. And yet the future, if you're a healthcare worker, the future looks a lot brighter if you can come to the US, especially if you have a big family that's depending on you. You come to the US and then you send remittances back home to family. The Philippine economy is very, very, very dependent on remittances and income from overseas workers, you know, some of whom come here, but really go all over the world. So, you know, it's a complicated world. And I, you know, the whole international system in some ways is being geared to feed people into the US economic system in the interests of not those people themselves and not the workers, but employers. And then using the reality of poverty and unequal standards of living in order to kind of like have this continual source of people that can get fed into it.
Well, we've reached the end of people actually typing questions into the chat. So I guess I would just open it up. Bruce, what do you think too, if anyone wants to ask a question ad hoc? They have a question that's just coming up, or else we're nearing the end.
Yeah, I think that's right. If there's any other questions, we also, if somebody wants to get in touch with the forum at uusf.org and thinks of some questions afterwards, maybe, you know, we could forward them to David. Maybe David would be kind enough to answer them. But we also want to put this, as I mentioned before, we want to put this video, we're going to put this video up and I'll be sending it out to everyone on our forum email list. If you want to be on that email list, you can put your name and your email address in the chat. So yeah, I think maybe we'll, unless there's some questions yet unasked, we should, is there somebody that just wanted to ask?
Yeah, Blair Beekman here. Thanks a lot for the presentation today. I really enjoyed it. I had a quick question. I like your David Bacon's ideas of addressing immigration in terms of unification, family unification. It's an interesting concept and way to work. And I was wondering, what are his feelings about immigration in other parts of the world? How does that compare? What lessons can we learn from immigration in other parts of the world, say Southeast Asia, between Thailand and Myanmar and Cambodia and Laos and that area? And there's different parts of the world that have different migration issues. Can you comment a bit about that?
Well, that's a really big question. You know, the system of people or the phenomenon of people going from poor countries to rich countries is happening all over the world, that's for sure. You know, you read about the deaths of people who drown in the Mediterranean, and it's really very much like the deaths of people who die in the desert crossing from Mexico into the US. And it is a product of how capitalism has developed. You know, it's in ways, it's partly the legacy of colonialism, you know, the establishment of colonies, and generally speaking, people are going from former colonies to their former colonial masters all over the world. So that's, I think, where a very large degree of the migration is coming from. But, you know, migration is the product of displacement. And so people get displaced by many different factors. one of which obviously is these differences in the standard of living and economics, but another one being war. Although I think we have to look at the displacement of people by war a little bit more deeply than just saying, well, okay, they're war refugees. Because if you look at, for instance, the people who came to the United States from El Salvador or Guatemala or Honduras, the wars that were fought in El Salvador and Guatemala were fought as a result of the imposition and the maintenance of a very unjust social order in which the US played an enormous role in keeping. And people were fighting against that in those civil wars. And the brutality of those wars led, 2 million people fled El Salvador as a result of it. So, you can call people war refugees if you want, but I think in some ways you can also say, well, these people are refugees from the way in which the US has dominated the political and economic lives of those countries in the interests of very small, cruel elite in those countries and in the interests of big US investors and companies here in the US. So
we have a few more questions that have come in. One from Betty Trainer. What can we do to help farm workers? Is there any good bill in Congress, or what can we do to pressure Vice President Harris?
Well, I think that the original bill that Biden proposed that would offer legal status to 11 million people without guest worker programs and without this E-Verify enforcement would be a good start to helping farm workers, for sure.
And then another one here. Comparing the news from Europe versus its immigrants, they don't militarize their frontiers and kill women and children that have reached their borders. In the US, it is more inhuman and brutal because of the devaluation of the Mexican race here. Would you agree with that statement?
Well, I think there's a lot of brutality in the way people have been dealt with in Europe as well, too. I mean, you have some good examples. You have the people who went down to the train stations to greet the migrants who were coming up, what was it, 2 or 3 years ago, when those waves of people were coming out of, especially the war in Syria and so forth. On the other hand, you had governments basically building chain link fences and setting dogs against the people and putting people in pretty awful camps. So I think, it's not really so much Europe versus the US here. I think it's really people trying to fight for a human rights-based way of looking at this and versus, this kind of racist and labor supply idea. And, that labor supply idea is just as current in Europe as, there have been guest workers going to Germany since the 60s. So.
She ran, the prime minister ran into a big problem, although politically, when she admitted way too many, I think it was Syrians mostly, a couple of years ago.
Well, I wouldn't say way too many. Actually, I think there was
I'm being ironic.
Okay. There was a movement within certain sections of in Germany that was very consciously anti-fascist, and they actually wanted to bring these large numbers of immigrants in, specifically to oppose the sort of xenophobia that they saw beginning to emerge again in Germany. So there was, a kind of a struggle within the ranks of the ruling, ruling people within Germany, and supported by progressive people in Germany. But I think maybe we should end here. I would just like this final note, I would like to just say that this next Wednesday, which happens to be Cinco de Mayo, coincidentally, but we have every Wednesday morning from 8 to 9, we have these vigils in front of the Unitarian Church at Franklin and Geary, where we raise certain issues. A lot of it's has to do with immigration. And given that we're on the eve of Mother's Day, come Wednesday, Mother's Day is the weekend, next weekend, Mother's Day weekend. We want to talk about, we were talking about a lot of unaccompanied children coming across the border. We also want to talk about the mothers who are not allowed to come across the border to be with their children because of policies that were originally put in place by Trump and are continuing to be imposed by this new government, Biden. So anyway, everyone is invited. We'll have music and we'll have signs, and we'll be out there this coming Wednesday from 8 to 9:30. We're going to be raising the question about the right to asylum, which is a human right, and to end Title 42, which is this policy by the Trump government that used the excuse of the pandemic to shut down immigration. It seems to me, I mean, if a logical demand would be, yeah, okay, and vaccinate everybody coming across the border. It also brings to mind this statistic that I just heard the other day, which is that of the 1 billion people on the planet that have so far been vaccinated, something like 0.3%, tiny fraction, are from countries that are the poorer countries. So another example of the staggering inequality that David referred to over and over again in his excellent presentation. So anyway, would welcome people to come Wednesday, 8 o'clock. We'll be out there for about an hour and a half. We'll have a chance to actually address this issue that's been raised here with the hundreds of people that come by in the morning commuting to work, many of whom are themselves immigrants and are very happy to see our presence out there. So with that, I would like to.
There's one final message from B. Beekman, which is an interesting way to look at the world. And I think I agree. Migration can actually be a very natural practice of the human condition, is how I've learned. Addressing economic and social conditions and warfare is one part of what may be a natural human trait, migration. So it's good to look at things from a larger picture, that migration doesn't have to be just totally exploitation.
Well, anyway, thank you, David. Excellent and important contribution to our understanding of what's going on in the world. So with that, I think we'll end. And thanks everybody for being part of this. Okay.
Thank you. It was good to be here.
Okay.
Thank you.